This is WWE superstar Drew McIntyre, and you're listening to the WWE Podcast.
The champ is
the one that everybody wants, me.
Becky Lynch is going to WrestleMania. Claymore!
Austin 316 says I just whipped your ass. This is my iron. You're going to acknowledge me.
All right, everyone. This is Memphis Mark coming to you from Mullet Manor with a little different interpretation. This week, we're going to do the Mullet Manor Memoirs. And I've got my all-star cast with Maintenance Maverick and, of course, the gardener Michael Gross and myself. And, guys, how you doing?
Well, I got to say, I'm doing really well. I'm getting over a little bit of sickness, a little bit of flu, kind of went into a respiratory thing, kind of clearing out the sinuses, feeling a little bit better, trying to enjoy this little bit of good weather before the winter really hits hard here in Louisville. But I'm really excited to do this project because you and I go back many, many years as friends, but we also go back many, many years as fans of what we are going to do the topic on. And I'm just really excited to put out a new thing that isn't just Wrestle Magic, but it's part of both what you do as far as NXT and what we do as Wrestle Magic in this joint production is going to be so amazing. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce my nephew, Mr. Maverick.
Hey guys, it's been a good week so far. Really happy to be on this project. I mean, as soon as I got mentioned to me about it, I was really excited. So just really happy to be a part of this. I grew up, outside of knowing anything about the territories. So I had to do my own research a little bit and try to understand some things that were being talked about between everybody, and hopefully I've learned just enough. But without further ado, let's get into it, Memphis Park.
Well, all right, guys, what we're going to delve into here is pretty much the last remaining territory that had a chance at money. Now, there's some people that we'll talk about possibly another territory that's still around, but I'm going to speak of in the South. And that's Memphis Wrestling. And with Memphis Wrestling, you got to understand, at one point in time, it had a share of 7 out of 10 TV sets. 7 out of 10 TV sets in a city as large as Memphis was just unheard of. But where it started was actually in the Ellis Auditorium. And that goes back into the 50s and before. I can't go any further back because I wasn't around, but I'll say that it started out. It's the house that people like Spudnik Monroe and Jackie Fargo and some of these guys built. Now, it was selling out. It was selling out, but they were going to end up tearing the building down. So at that time, you had a couple different promoters that were promoting in Memphis. And, so you had Les Wolf that was around here. You had a couple other guys, but there ended up being a split where the Herb Welch family got involved, and they were the big time wrestlers here. So
Now, the Welches, if I'm not mistaken, were very aligned with the NWA, or were they seceding?
Well, they were, yes, very aligned with NWA, and but they did kind of when they started this territory. Well, when they made the move to the Coliseum, they created their own entity. They created their own NWA per se, if you know what I mean. They were that big, but they did use them as a governing body for a while. You remember the old? We'll have to get with the president and check on the match. But,
absolutely. There was a council, and for everybody who doesn't know, with the territory system, that you had people like Paul Bosch, you had Herb Welch, you had so many different names. Tully Blanchard's father, Joe Blanchard, you had Fritz Von Erich, all these people who were part of the National Wrestling Alliance. And when you seceded, you created your own wrestling champion. So it was very big with the hotbed, and especially the biggest hotbed was the Mid-South, which is what we are talking about now. So I acquiesce.
Well, I tell you, the biggest of all at that time. You got to consider, yeah, there was still segregation in the South. So you pretty much had the black clientele, your black customers up top, and your white customers down on the bottom. Now, a lot of times that would cause a problem, but they had the one thing that made them different, made Mid-South wrestling or Memphis wrestling different. And that was a gentleman by the name of Spudnik Monroe. And he was everything that a bigot or a white racist would have hated. He liked black music. He dressed in a black mannerism. He just acted different. He had a white streak, a bleached blonde white streak down the middle of his hair, like he was telling everybody he was a skunk and he'd spray him. I mean, he was tough. He was legitimately tough. And to show you the difference in the times, I don't have the exact year. Oh, you wait a minute. I believe it's January 14th, 1960. Rock M. Bumbar, 27 of 1415. I'm actually quoting the Memphis Press Scimitar, the local newspaper, of 1450 Spartan Drive. They gave his address in this newspaper article. Known in the wrestling world as Spudnik Monroe and another wrestler, Mr. Hickman, 27, and then again, they give his address, were charged with disorderly conduct following an arrest at 12:45 in the morning in a Negro cafe on Bill Street in Hernando. I think Michael, you said the Blues Hall.
I believe it was the Blues Hall. I used to run it, by the way.
Yeah, but they were arrested at 12:45 yesterday morning in a Negro cafe at Bill and Hernando, where they were drinking beer. That was, and the judge was said that she had never heard of any white man being arrested for that. She fined him $26, and he had to forfeit his pay for that night. Now, that's just giving you a little bit of a peek into what these wrestlers were going through back then, because they worked together. The more heat one got, the other one, you know what I mean? So these guys were friends.
Now, may I expand upon that a little bit?
Please.
The fact that Sputnik Monroe, his persona was carried on to the next generation, and you know who that next generation person was, who embraced the so-called color barrier, and that's Dusty Rhodes. It's absolutely true. Yeah. However, Sputnik Monroe lived who he actually was. He was a gentleman who wrestled during the day and at night liked to live his lifestyle of listening to blues music, hanging out with his friends. And because he was a television persona and a media persona and a white man, a bleach blonde, built like no one's business, they said, you cannot do this. He stepped in as an adversary to everybody. Now, they hated that, and they would always tell him, quoting the movie Memphis Heat, if you arrest me, that's fine. I've got the bail money in my back pocket. I'll be back here tomorrow hanging out with my friends, so leave me alone. Now, with that being said, Maverick, you can take this one. They said, and this is also quoting the movie, what did every African-American house have in their household?
So, from the movie, something that I don't believe I will be able to forget after hearing it was every African-American had 3 pictures in their household. First one was of Jesus, second one was of Martin Luther King, and the third one was of Sputnik Monroe. Now, looking at what had happened back then, times have changed so much, and it is just such a difference in today's world, because I couldn't imagine first off, everything being segregated like that, and second off, just hanging out with your friends, not being rowdy or anything, just getting arrested for it. Things like that really caught my attention while watching the whole documentary, and that kind of gave me respect for the name of Sputnik Monroe, even though I hadn't heard of him until today. So, yeah, I'm really happy that I've gotten to learn about that. But let's move on. Mark, what do you have next for us, my friend?
Okay, well, real quickly, I do want to add, it's people like you that are in the armed services that are the reason that I'm able to sit anywhere I want to and sit next to whoever I want to. So don't think we don't appreciate that. But we will go directly into now with the Coliseum. It's a 12,000 seat arena shaped in a almost like a bubble. Kind of at its time, it was pretty innovative, but they weren't using it during the week, so they work a deal out to pretty much they were getting that arena 4 Mondays for $1,200 a month. Now that would be, I'm just gonna estimate probably around $7,000 to $9,000 a month nowadays.
That's pennies.
That's a great deal.
Pennies.
I mean, but okay, so we go from there. So now you've got a couple different networks going here. They have some people call it the Chitlin circuit. Some people call it the pork chop circuit. There's names where Phil Hickerson or maybe one of the interns, Don or Al Green, they would take some of the lesser known wrestlers and they would hit Jonesboro, Arkansas, West Memphis, Blytheville, and go around. And then you had your main circuit of the wrestlers. And Michael, that's the guys that came up into your territory. They would hit Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville. Well, the Knoxville was a fighting area with a couple territories, but they would go
Louisville, definitely Greensboro. We got to talk about Evansville. Definitely all those territories they were expanding into, but it was the most viable product because at this point, I would say, and tell me if I'm overstepping my boundaries, that all these talents started to find a place where people really believed in kayfabe. And that's what was the biggest thing. It was kayfabe, the believability that wrestling is not scripted, it's real, was riotous. So these people like Al Green and the Dream Machine, but we'll get to him in a bit, is the fact that that was what was sucking in. So we had to go to those cities, those major cities where people still believed.
Absolutely. And you could get for riding in the car with your opponent that night, even though you're both going to the same city. You could get fired for something like that. But these guys, they started this up kind of, you got to consider the cojones they had to have on them to kind of spit in the face of everybody and go that we can do this. Jerry Jarrett was a young wrestler, a blonde haired guy that got beat up every week, but everybody loved to watch him. And you had people like Tojo Yamamoto and all of these guys. And Tojo was a small guy from Hawaii, but they put him up as a Japanese guy, and he had these wooden shoes, and he'd get beat up the whole match. But as soon as he got hold of one of his shoes, bam, blood come out. Even on Saturday morning wrestling, if he hit you with that shoe, the guy went down and he come up bleeding. But yeah, you had some great talent that was back then, and it was real, because I can remember the first time as a kid being able to go into a restaurant that I had to go through the kitchen back to a meeting room, and there was Jerry Jarrett and Tojo Yamamoto after a match.
Oh dear Lord.
My heart sunk. But even then, they left through separate doors. I had the advantage of restaurant management knowing me, being a kid, and let me back there. But that's how big it was. You had to go through the kitchen, back through a hallway, down there, a long hallway to see a table in the back, and that's where they were eating. But yeah, guys, from there, you've got going into like Louisville. Louisville was the biggest city. You had Nashville, which was drawing good, but Louisville, and wasn't that in the Louisville Gardens, Michael?
Yes, it was. Actually, I think somewhere off 8th Street here downtown. It's still there. It's just nothing happens in it. I took a couple of pictures. I sent them to Cornette. He hasn't responded. But yeah, he's never going to respond. But yeah, the Louisville Gardens was a major draw. Obviously, you have Mid-South Coliseum, and I'm trying to think of like the other major city draws, but you would know better than I would.
Well, I mean, even a city like Tupelo would do really well.
Obviously, yes.
So, and then you would draw all through Mississippi and even up from a little bit from Alabama. Now they never went down because that's going into the Mid-South territory, and that's
Bill Watts, yeah.
But and like I said, with Buddy Wayne. Now Buddy Wayne was the main guy that did the pork chop circuit towards the end. He was a guy that you could throw under a mask. He was a big guy. He could wrestle, but he produced Ken Wayne and a few other these. I think he's even got a grandson that's out there getting ready to start up. But they took people like a cop from up in Tennessee that was bald headed, and he was like 6'6", great shape, ex-military guy, and he wanted to get into wrestling. And Lawler was, at that time, Lawler was becoming such a big talent. He had gotten the push. He was an artist that showed his artwork to some guys, and they started letting him sell his artwork. And the next thing you know, he got into the wrestling, and he went through the small circuits, and he built himself up. And at that time, one of his biggest finds that I think was the Mongolian Stomper.
Yes.
The guy was a cop half the time, and then he wrestled. But I mean, he was great. But these guys could find talent. Plowboy Frazier, just a big, heavy set guy from down in Mississippi, but he just fit the part. And
now was Plowboy the same guy that was in Pee-wee's Big Adventure?
I don't know if I'm not up on my feet.
It might have been Plowboy, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I mean, come on, guys. There's 40 years of wrestling memories in this brain, but I know that Plowboy, he had quite a bit. Mongolian Stomper, actually, he was green in Memphis, and they sent him over to Canada, and he wrestled for Stu for a while, and then came back after actually learning how to do drop toe hold for a second. Yes,
would that be up in the Stampede sort of leagues, or what exactly did Stu own at the time?
Yeah. Stampede, yeah. It was all the Calgary. That's what he called it, Stampede, because apparently up in Canada, being a cowboy is bigger and rodeos are bigger supposedly than in the South in America. So yeah, it's very, very interesting culture. But getting back to it, the Mongolian Stomper, the guy actually was legitimately taller than Andre the Giant, but they would never put them together and do a back-to-back. Very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, but you would have we had a young tag team come through in the early 70s there, Ricky and Robert Gibson.
The Gibson brothers.
Yeah, a great tag team, but you've got Robert or the Ricky that gets hurt, and then Robert goes on and meets up with this guy, this other guy. And there again, Lawler and Jarrett and Memphis Wrestling says, hey, let's put them in some tights. Let's put some bandanas on them. Bring them out to some music. And Memphis Wrestling was the first to do music videos, to add like music. I mean, as simple as that sounds, that was a big, big deal. And with the Rock and Roll Express, later on with another tag team that the two guys couldn't draw any kind of a crowd, but you put them together, put fancy coats on them and call them the Fabulous Ones, and have Jeff come out, and bam, they're selling out arenas, and it's just Tommy Rich. I mean,
guy looks like a bullfrog.
He's fired up though. He fired up. But Bill Dundee, that comes over from New Zealand, but everybody thinks he's from Australia, and he takes on the Australian side of things, and to this day, most people still think he's from Australia. Paul Orndorff, it goes on. He ends up breaking Lawler's nose, and then Lawler ends up breaking his nose when he returns.
Got his receipt.
Yeah, nice little receipt. The original kind of the Midnight Express, not with Cornette, but Dennis Condrey found his success with Phil Hickerson. They were the biggest thing at the time, going against like a Dundee and Jimmy Valiant, which Jimmy Valiant couldn't wrestle a lick, but man, looked great going to the ring.
Don't talk that way about Boogie Woogie, okay? He did that lick the thumb and stick someone in the neck thing, which later became the Asian Spike. So come on.
Yeah. Oh, man.
It should be called the Boogie Woogie Spike.
But
and back then he was Handsome Jimmy, by the way.
Absolutely. I've got a wrestling card from September 18th. This is, of course, they didn't put the years on this, but this is Monday night, no increases in the price for a triple main event. The AWA World Champion Nick Bockwinkel going against Handsome Jimmy Valiant. Now, listen to these other two. You got Joe LeDuc and John Louis going against Jerry Lawler and the Mongolian Stomper.
That's a bloodbath.
And then you've got Mr. Wrestling going against Terry Sawyer. The first match is Tommy Gilbert versus Lou Thez. Wayne Ferris. Wayne Ferris, the Honky Tonk Man's on this card. And then this is just an average week. So you can see where the Memphis Wrestling had such a draw. And to where you get guys like Maverick that are going back and looking at some of this stuff. And I send him old tapes, and I know he probably gets tired of it, but you watch some of that. The next thing you know, you've watched the whole hour show. And that's what we got. And I don't think any other wrestling show back in its day put out the product that Memphis Wrestling. And now, Michael, you got to see, the second version. Anything I saw on Monday, you saw. What day did they come through Louisville?
Well, see, as far as wrestling went, I would get to see whatever you saw on ESPN.
Okay.
And it would be, yeah. So I always got the later carbon copies because while we're a few years different, I also lived in Cleveland, Ohio, which was hardwired for cable much before many other people. So when I was seeing stuff that you had seen, sometimes they would show us reruns that we knew were reruns from reading dirt sheets or mags or anything like that. And it's like, okay, I already know who's going to win this. That's kind of what also hurt the territories too, was bad syndication. But when Memphis had the ESPN slot after World Class had lost it, when it was CWA before it became USWA, and I was watching a lot of it, I was really entrenched and loving the characters. But of course, with everything and the death of the territories, you start to see stars go away. Who's a star? Who's left over? Things like that. But there is a special match to you, and you know what I'm talking about, that makes Memphis Wrestling, the CWA, and everything that was Memphis as a territory, the match that put them on the map, that made everybody in the whole world stop and say, this is a match. And that's why Andy Kaufman said in 1983, Memphis is the wrestling capital of the world. What is that match?
Oh man, you're throwing me you're throwing me under the because there's so many that I could go back.
It's your favorite match of all time.
Well, I've sit there and talked with you so many nights. Back in the day when you were still bartending back in the day. Man, you go back with Lawler, man. You could go with man, you had your Dundee matches, of course, and you had your all of his championships, the Kurt Hennings, the Bockwinkles, the
Mark. It's the match that made you.
Oh, you're killing me. Come on, just come on with it.
Tupelo.
Oh, well, okay. There we go. Now, okay, I apologize, folks. He is correct. And what we were referring to is, to me, it is the cinematic. It is the it is the epitome of Southern wrestling. The whole thing. You'd have to watch the whole clip from Lance Russell putting on a show, saying literally smoking a cigarette, which
I love that.
I know people, that's far fetched to people to understand, but smoking a cigarette and saying, "What? They're fighting. They're fighting where? Come on, grab a camera. Get that cable. Come on, we'll edit it later. We'll edit it later." And they go down a stairwell, and there are four guys tearing it up in the concession stand. And that's Jerry Lawler, Bill Dundee, Wayne Ferris, and Larry Latham. The Hollywood, what were they called? The Hollywood Blondes. Wasn't that? I think that they were going under that moniker then. But the fight was just freaking great. But I found out years later, the key thing that I was able to enlighten people to, that now when they go back, it's extremely funny to go back and watch. They were told it was the end of the season, so they were going to throw out all the condiments and all the stuff. So they didn't care about anything that was in there. But there was one important piece of equipment that was their moneymaker.
All right, let's see if Maverick knows what it is. What is it, Mav?
All right, let's see if I can do the voice quite as good as Memphis Mark does it. Do not touch the popcorn machine.
Yes.
You do whatever you want. I don't care whatever you want. Just do not touch the popcorn machine. And anybody that goes back and watch the full video, I suggest you watch the full, not the edited, the full video, so you can get Lance Russell in there. And Lance Russell was such.
Oh God, he was amazing.
He was such an important. He was our version of a Gordon Soley or whatever. If you travel around the different territories, you'd have a voice that you knew. And Lance Russell, and we had a local, the station, the actual wrestling left one station, in which this is the only wrestling show in the country that's getting paid. The TV station is paying them to produce. They're doing all the editing. They're doing all the production out of their end. That's how big wrestling was. But they went from, they changed stations, and the local weatherman, Dave Brown, came on. So you had, as Lawler would put it, you had Lance Russell, Banana Nose, and then you had Dave Brown, the straight guy, and they were great. They were just freaking great. And Maverick, I did want to say something. I didn't know when Michael mentioned earlier that Cleveland was hardwired. I didn't even know if you understood what that meant, because I was just thinking about that. I got cable, and when we got cable in Memphis, one side of the street got it and the other side didn't for like 2 months. It was we had 3 channels, man. 3 channels. Then we get cable and the world opens up. And now look at I don't even know if anybody uses cable anymore. I think everybody's streaming. So
well, with this infancy of cable, the biggest angle of all time is starting to bloom. Now that Lawler has become something, Fargos are starting to get a little elder. Jimmy Hart is becoming one of the biggest heel managers of all time in history. We have a person like the Dream Machine. Yes.
Michael, let me add, Jimmy Hart at the time is a local musician with Jimmy Hart and the Gentrys. He was a friend of Lawler's, and when Lawler got into doing some music, Jimmy Hart was like the backup band and helped him write the songs around or change the words around in a popular song to make it towards him. But Lawler brings Jimmy Hart on. Now, please continue on, Michael.
As I was saying, so you have quite a glut of popularity in wrestling as far as where Memphis is. The territory is growing and growing, and it's the biggest thing, especially like their timeshares that they have, like you were saying, like a 7 out of 10 in Memphis. Well, that's a million viewers versus, the outskirts, but the fans were rabid. They were crazy. They were insane. And you can cite many books. I like to cite Death of the Territories by Tim Hornbaker, which is really good. They would talk about some of these matches. If Jerry Lawler had his head shaved, there was a riot. They actually had a riot. There were arrests, and they did it for fun. They didn't do it for fun. They did it because they believed in what they were doing. Now, you look at everybody who is in wrestling, you say that they're a stage actor and everything else. To some degree, you could say that, but they don't get SAG. They don't get SAG benefits, and that's really sad. However, these people should. And the fact that they got their tire slashed, they got beat up, they got jumped, they've got knifed, they got stabbed. I hated villains in movies, but if I ever saw the actor, I didn't knife him. And that's what Memphis was in 1981 to 1984.
Yeah.
It was the most hotbed of any kind of interacting actual wrestling. You have to pardon my stuttering. That you've ever seen in your life. Riots, cage matches that people fires, infernos. I mean, we're talking about anything that you would think is crazy and extreme today was born right over by the Liberty Bowl, and it was at the Mid-South Coliseum. And every Monday night served to make the pay-per-view, or excuse me, every Saturday morning studio wrestling served to make every Monday night just that much bigger of a sellout, and that's what happened. But now let's talk about that wrestling boom infancy. Yes, Mr. Maverick.
So I wanted to ask you guys about something else that had to do with the belief in kayfabe and how it was so heavy back then. So there was a certain match that had happened that involved The Rock's father, Rocky Johnson, and Jerry Lawler, where they were almost trying to make it less of a wrestling match and trying to promote Rocky Johnson at the time more as a boxer, and that he was legitimate and this fight was going to be some sort of hybrid of wrestling and boxing at the time. Can you guys elaborate on that and explain it a little bit? Because I know that had to have helped out with the belief of kayfabe and made the audience really feel like, wow, this is actually going on, and really would have swayed anybody thinking, oh, maybe this is fake at the time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that they put the gloves. Lawler said that he could fight. He starts naming like he was this type boxer and that type.
Oh, Christ.
Yeah, and going into it, so they put the gloves on them both. And, of course, Rocky wears them out. But just like the scene and in Rocky, to where Hulk Hogan or whoever it was, I can't remember, where Rocky had the gloves on, Lawler got the gloves off and jumped Rocky after the match. And, of course, that creates more heat on him. Because Rocky's shown everybody how talented he is, because he's jabbing him and just, Lawler can't do anything. But when those gloves come off, he snuck up behind him, bam. I think he even pile driver him, which at that time was just, that was the illegal move. If you pile drive it, and you got to remember at the early, some of those stages, you couldn't knock, or you could knock somebody over the top rope, but you couldn't throw them over the top rope. So a different time in wrestling back then, and Michael mentioned Lawler getting his hair cut. Now, when you're the biggest star of your era, he's drawing big houses every time. When Lawler touches something, it's gold. For him to get his hair cut, that showed. Now, prior to that, he was in a feud with Bill Dundee, and Bill Dundee gets his hair cut. So now this is the way it was explained to me by a short guy from New Zealand at a bar outside of Pickwick that he owns, that it was the most money he'd ever made in a couple weeks' time. Bill Dundee, he got paid a big chunk of money from Mid-South Wrestling for some booking he did down there. He comes up to Memphis, he gets his hair cut. So what are they going to do to top that? because they thought that that would be the end of the feud. Everybody'd be done with it. But the crowd, Jerry Jarrett said he walked out into the crowd and he was like, oh no, we're not done with this. So they cut Bill Dundee's his wife's hair.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, but he said he made 5,000. Jerry Jarrett. Now, Jerry Jarrett was known as one of the worst payers in the business. But he said he made $5,000 back in there. Now, I'm not sure the equivalent of it today, but for $10,000, you can shave my head. So with nothing, we shoot for 500. But
well, I find it very interesting, like what they innovated at that time. So let's talk the 70s to 84. Let's talk to before the Vince expansion. So everybody who is anybody in the wrestling industry at that point had passed through Memphis. If you did not pass through Memphis, you didn't cut your chops. Ric Flair, Memphis. Magnum TA, Memphis. Everybody. You put a person up, and I'm going to tell you, they passed through Memphis. That was a testing ground, and it was truly the king of where you were supposed to be as far as going forward in your life as being a wrestling. Just being a wrestler. And the fact that, like, it got buried 85, sealed a tomb. And once Vince did the expansion, when it was, WrestleMania 3, whatever else, like it was buried really hard. So before that, we had some of the biggest angles, some of the biggest things, and some of the biggest superstars that ever came out of anywhere. So where did The Undertaker wrestle?
Absolutely. Big Red and Master of Pain.
Exactly.
And Master of Pain, they use that to persona also on this other guy. Remember this guy named Sid?
Oh, I remember prank calling him. He doesn't like me too much, but all right. So let's dial back a little bit earlier. So the Fargos are going away. We're talking the early days, and a guy that we're both fans of, Dream Machine.
Troy Graham.
So yeah, let's talk about him, and let's also delve into what their tag team situation was in those early 80s before we get into Kaufman.
Well, now Troy Graham was he could have gone all over the country because he was the closest to Dusty Rhodes on the stick. Troy could come up. I can't even think of any of it off the top of my head, but something about walking through a graveyard, and he had the gift of gab, and he didn't have the big athletic body, but he was big. So him and Phil Hickerson, which Phil didn't like to go very far from Memphis because he had a little bar up in Jackson, Tennessee. And Troy Graham was actually taking care all during the late 70s, early 80s. He was taking care of his mother that was sick. So he actually in the local, local strip clubs here. So, he was a legit, a badass. And so you put two guys like that, and Phil Hickerson wasn't bad on the mic either. So those were your good heels. For them to bring back occasionally a Jackie Fargo, or bring up some of these guys like a Tommy Rich, because they really beat the crap out of Tommy Rich. Those are some good old days, man. That's Saturday wrestling that you just didn't get stuff like that on Saturday morning. Everybody saved it for you to pay for that ticket. And
something that I'd like to throw in as well was, after watching the Memphis Heat documentary, I have to say the heels and faces, no matter who they were, the promos were just different back then when they were on the mic. It seemed so much more legitimate and so much more real. It felt like everything that they were saying, almost anybody could really relate to, almost anybody could say it, but you felt what they were saying, especially when Jerry the King Lawler was on the mic, or anybody, the threats that they were making, it sounded legitimate, like anybody on the street would say it, not just, a WWE superstar now who's talking about, Finn Balor and his demon persona. Nobody talked about anything like that because there wasn't anything close to that yet. Everything seemed so much more real back then, and I think that also helped out with everything with kayfabe and everybody believing it so much more. But please continue, Mark. This is fascinating.
Oh man, well, I was just, and these guys back in the days, they had to deal with politics just like nowadays. You had a promoter's son, George Goulas, that was a terrible, terrible. And the guys had to carry him, and they knew that when they had a match with him, they're not gonna be in the last three matches. And when the old days, when they say pay window, like you had to, they used to make it real when they were talking about their money. An average person could relate to when they said that, man, that guy jumped in and cost that guy the match. That cost him half of his purse. It just seemed real. And like you said, Matt, the way that they conducted the interviews, I think that a lot of younger guys should go back and maybe watch a little of the older stuff and see the guy that gets beat up. They go to commercial break. You know what I'm talking about. And then they bring him back out after he's cleaned up a little bit. That 5 minutes or 3 minutes they give him on the stick to where he's just ripping a new butthole out of some. I mean, that's the kind of, the anger and the fire that I think some of these younger guys need. I mean, that's just my opinion. Old guy talking. I ain't got nothing but a mouthful of memories, but I can tell you, I can go through them. But those were great days. Bill Dundee was a small guy. He comes in with another a gentleman that speaks like him with that tone of voice, and George Burns. And George Burns ends up going back over across the seas, going back to there was a big promoter over in Australia. Michael, do you remember that guy's name? He was big, man. He was you had the whole country of Australia, and he had no competition over there.
No, honestly, I know who you're talking about, but I cannot remember his name at this point. But
yeah, but I mean, it was a good promotion. You could feed your good, but Dundee takes the money, he takes the money that he gets off when he gets his hair cut, and he buys a house in Hendersonville, Tennessee. And nobody would have thought anything about that. Biggest investment the man ever made. The man, the Hendersonville, Tennessee is like where all the big country stars live nowadays. So if you bought a house in 1982, your house, well, we won't go into that side of it.
Yeah, no joke.
Yeah, good investment. But that's what some of these guys did. Now, a lot of them, you had guys like right towards the end of where you're talking about, Michael. They bring a guy out like Kamala.
Oh, gosh. So, Matt, do you know the beginning of Kamala?
I will be completely honest. I believe one of the only things that I had really heard about Kamala was that he was one of the only people who were allowed to slam Andre. Is that true?
Him and Harley Race.
There's been a few, but yeah, Kamala, his whole thing is he showed up and he was in the backyard. The story I hear is he was just sitting on a bench, and Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler look at him and say, "Who are you?" He goes, "I'm Sugar Bear Harris." I said, "No, you're not. You're Kamala." And they painted him up and made him come out of the pond that came out of their backyard.
Out of Jerry Jarrett's backyard.
Yes, Jerry Jarrett's backyard. Kamala, like I've seen the vignette, Kamala, da 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 da. I had never seen anybody from the Memphis territory get fast-tracked that fast to go up to WWF. He was the first man, and like me young, like watching territories and everything, everybody was usually just a minor bit player, but it's like Kamala came up fast, and I was like, what the father? And when he came up, I thought, oh, I hope it's Abdul the Butcher, and I was like, no, Hogan's not going to work Abdullah. Then I was like 10, but I was hoping. One can always dream.
Oh, and there probably wouldn't have been what was it, Papa Shamanga, or what was that guy's name?
Papa Shango.
Shango. That was a 2.0 version of Kamala. They were trying to recreate the Kamala just had they put some little smoke, like some smoke bombs up, and had him walking through the bushes. And it was just the fact, you have to understand how in an infant kind of stage production, and but nobody else was doing this. No, you weren't going to another wrestling show in Alabama, Florida. They weren't showing some guy coming through some bushes with smoke and background music, and a guy, it sounded
scary as hell, and just running at everybody. And he's a cannibal. Oh
Yeah.
my God, run from him. He's missing teeth. And he has a handler. Oh, the handler had to go to the bathroom. Oh my God, he's loose in the stadium. That's what Memphis did. That was creating so much excitement without even having anything in the ring. So you go to the intermission and you say, Kamala's loose. Everybody be careful. It was brilliance. So everybody's out there going to buy the merch, but they're looking around for him. And then maybe he ran down a hallway. Everybody would scream because it's a dead hallway where there's nothing. So they go scream back towards where the merchandise area was.
Oh, yeah.
That's brilliance.
That seems like genius marketing. You could probably scar some kids with that. Here comes Kamala chasing a little kid down the hallway. Then all of a sudden he turns and he's gone forever. Make a complete memory and some more hallmark moments for everybody.
That was Memphis ideas.
That's absolutely. Look, I've actually seen them take some of the wrestlers' kids that were in the back that knew Kamala, and of course they knew, but they would let them run down the hallway like they were like running from something. They would literally clear out an area. But back then, you didn't run far. You ran like a few feet and then you stopped because you wanted to make sure. Now, nowadays, people just keep running. But everybody would run a little bit and stop, and you would hear voices. Get back, get him back, get him back. You never saw Kamala. It was like two guys out in the hallway that were going, get back, get back, get him back, get him back. Come on, let's get him. And then, the people, it echoed through the hallway. And that's all you needed, brother. That is all you needed. And then look, we even had in those early stages, we had a couple visits. I only remember two from the greatest big man, I think, of all time, which was Bruiser Brody. And Bruiser Brody was such a big guy. And the way the stadium was set up, when they showed video of him, he just looked so much bigger than everybody, and he would get berserk and go through the crowd and clear a whole section out. Because believe me, if you saw Bruiser Brody, and I don't know how many people know who that is, but if you saw him coming at you, I'm not a small guy, but I'm getting the heck out of the way.
There's always been like the speculation, Bruiser Brody versus Haku.
Ooh. Tell you what, I don't want to be in between the ones and when it comes time to pay the tab.
Fair enough. So let's build up. Let's build up to the best line, the best storyline of all time that lasted well over 20 years. So what's happening in Memphis at this point is you have a lot of talent that's being trained, a lot of talent that is being showcased, but we have a lot of more what we call national branded talents or companies, promotions. I don't like to use the word brand. We have the AWA, which is supposed to be world recognized. We have the NWA, which is the world standard. We have the WWF in New York and the, New England states, the Blue Bloods, which are taking over. Now you have what is considered the capital of wrestling, which would be Memphis. And then you also have Dallas. Now the West Coast, the WWA had already given up. Dallas was also the WCCW. I don't want to give the Von Erichs, they're not due. Florida at this point was the Grahams, and they weren't doing what they needed to do to catch up. They were just kind of floundering in mediocrity. They had a lot of talent. They were training talents, but they were basically a training ground and not really giving back or producing anything that could be national television. All these other territories I've talked about actually had television spots that I could see as a 10-year-old. So all of a sudden, the biggest angle happens, and that is Andy Kaufman. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, the lead into that now, Andy was going around in nightclubs and calling himself the intergender world heavyweight champion. He could fight any woman. And that was his skit. That was, he was going around and he was fighting women. And he would pull some little scamp or some little deal and always pull out a win. And he kept on. Well, eventually he wants to come in. I want to say it was WCW first. I can't remember. It was he tried another company first.
Well, it had to be NWA at that time.
It may have been, yeah, it may have been, and but they didn't want to go with it. But then he gets a hold of Lawler and Jarrett, and that's just right up their alley. I mean, and how did Jerry Jarrett put it? He said that he was told by his father years ago that when you go through a stream, you turn over every rock because eventually you'll find a piece of gold under one, and that's what he did. When he got Kaufman in there, because it was a dream. Kaufman was on the biggest television show at the time, Taxi. And there again, a lot of people are not going to know what Taxi is, but it was actually a very good, well-written sitcom that was on for several years. And he was the likable, laughable character on there. So to see him come out as a villain was just, at first it was a little alarming, but then you just really started, because he did a great promo where he was like, all you guys down in Memphis, Tennessee, y'all talk like Memphis.
Great.
And from then on, it was just it was gold. I mean, give me your version, because you're seeing it from a whole nother. You're a little younger than me now, and he's still got to get under your skin, Michael.
It was a whole different thing to learn about what he was doing as far as wrestling, because I got into it 1 year later. So when yes, yeah, 84 was my break-in year. I mean, I watched a little bit with my grandfather in Niagara Falls. He would spit at NWA TV, which you could get at on like base. It wasn't cable, like antenna, and he would yell at the TV. So I'd watch a little bit with him. But like, actually, when I got into it, 84, and so that ankle had already passed. Just like finding out like a lot of the Von Erich situations and everything passed. I was 9-10 years old, so I'm buying like encyclopedias about wrestlers and everything else. So it was a different thing. They never talked about Andy Kaufman because he was kind of like blackballed from the whole situation. However, he did so much for Memphis wrestling, and he did more for it in putting it on the map, even though it was on the map. And he was right when they did Man on the Moon, and they said that Memphis was the wrestling capital of the world. They were completely right at that point. In 1 year, it was so far down the chain because it wouldn't evolve. They didn't evolve. They didn't believe in everything that could change, and they had so much nepotism. And you look at every territory that kept on, it was nepotism that also held them down, and the ability to not evolve and not ability to have pay-per-view. But we'll get into that.
Yeah.
The fact was that that was the greatest angle probably in wrestling history. I don't think there's anything better.
Yeah, and I think the time you're talking that when Jarrett left the promotion, wouldn't that have been when Lawler bought him out? That would have been about 85, 88. Okay, yeah, somewhere in that range. Yeah. So yeah, I see your evolving part. I actually never looked at it like that, to tell you the truth. But I mean,
the slap on Letterman. David Letterman's show, yeah, and then the fact that years later, like throughout history, they would always say the senior editor of Pro Wrestling Illustrated, David Letterman. They would always say stuff like that. I always think David Letterman has always had his hand in wrestling. It's weird, but something we could also look up. But yeah, that was the biggest moment in Memphis wrestling history and wrestling in the world. That was the shot heard around the world.
That is, and before that, now, am I getting my time right? When was the David Schultz slap? That would have been
2 years later, or a year and a half later.
year
So
and
what it comes down to is the fact that they never capitalized on that more than making it territorial. They had national exposure.
absolutely.
But the
No.
agreement was, and we will talk about this in future episodes, was you never break down the infrastructure of territorial wrestling. But this asshole named Vince McMahon came in and he told his father he wouldn't. So I digress. Anybody else?
So some stuff that I knew about Andy Kaufman and everything was going from comedian straight into professional wrestling, and then going straight to a heel, especially at a time where kayfabe was so big. That really could have gotten him potentially murdered, especially being in the South. You know, there's a certain level of respect and everything, especially towards women and everything down there, that you don't cross a line. That was more the older times where if you hit a woman, you were probably getting jumped in the parking lot type of thing. So for that time, that is extremely huge. And but yeah, I also digress. Off to Mark.
Maverick, I was going to say, to go to your point to how big it was, the Iron Sheik was on Memphis Wrestling on the Saturday show. And of course, he does his spiel, Spit on America, the whole deal. They get a phone call at the Channel 5 studios that a son and his father have gotten their rifles. And they live close by and they're walking down to the studio. So they literally brought police into the taping and put them out behind they had like two little wooden grandstands that people sit on. And on that show, there's cops in the background, and it's because of that called in threat. Now that's how serious. And there was a police station right across the street. So they were some serious wrestling fans, sir. If that can even make it into your mind how serious they were, that's how it was back in the day.
I think Memphis was also the king of kayfabe, and so it was just like the perfect place. Like you could promote anything, you can build anything, and so as we start to get closer to the early 80s and we start to have closed circuit, which we all talked about going into pay-per-view, we think about the situation where, well, what's the next step? And the overgrown demon of WWE, WWF, takes that next step and starts taking over territories. However, can you take over every territory? That is a question. So, Mav?
Well, to a certain extent, you can, but there's always going to be outliers. And there still is one, that being Puerto Rico. That is, I believe, the last one standing at this time. And it's impressive to see that they still have not been bought out or anything, and that they're still going. But that's realistically the only one that I can think of that I know is still going to this day.
The death place of Bruiser Brody.
Yes.
You know, that you want to know how tough it is there. The wrestlers kill other wrestlers there.
Yeah. True.
It's a rough place. I've heard of some disagreements down there because the law would only go so, like, security in those events would only go so long. So if the matches went long, you could have the last match, which would be the biggest, and you wouldn't barely have any security there. So I mean, and I'm not sure how big of an arena they're playing in front of, but can't be good. Can't be good because in the Mid-South Coliseum, I've seen them almost have to fight their way to the back. So and I know in Tupelo there was some rough occasions like that, and I've heard of stories in Louisville Gardens the same way. So it wasn't just a local thing. It was a tough time. It was a different time. It was just a different time.
Well, so let's talk about then the 90s to the 2000s. What Memphis, when they merged into the USWA. Now, I can tell you what that merging is, so I will speak. It was the AWA dying very hard, and it was Dallas not doing so well, and so the CWA, or Memphis, the territory, they all decided that they would band together, and they had so many channels syndicated and everything else that they would become the next thing to try to conquer Vince McMahon, the WWF at the time, whereas Jim Crockett Promotions were about to sell to Turner to become WCW. However, this whole thing was a super cluster F, and none of it really worked out. And some of the stars were featured on other programs. Like you had people like Black Bart, who's a great hand and a great wrestler, but he's jobbing on WWF TV, and all of a sudden he's going to come over and be on this pay-per-view or something like that. And I'm just using him as an example. He's not the person. But the point is, with the expansion happening so fast and it glommed onto so much stuff, I think that what happened with Memphis and going into the whole USWA merger was just the biggest ball of S that I've never seen in my life. How would you say about that, Mr. Mark?
Yes, I'd have to agree. Your pretty much your synopsis there is exactly right. That's the territories were dying, and I just heard Jarrett speak on one of the another podcast that he was speaking about that Fritz called him and told him that hey, I'm about to go into bankruptcy. Do you want to come down here and look? And he reverted back to that same quote I said earlier about his grandfather telling him that. And he went there and he said, I believe it was Eric. What was it? Eric. I can't think of the guy's name that was real big then, but he was actually sleeping in the sportatorium because they hadn't been paid in like 4 or 5 weeks. So he goes to speak to Fritz, and Fritz calls him to his house and says that, look, you're going into business with Kevin and Carrie. Those 2 drug addicts won't show up. And now this is their father with their mother at the sink in a kitchen telling Jarrett that he shouldn't go into business with his sons. But he did, and he made it kind of successful for a little while. He made his money back. But this is how he did it. At that time, they had a dip company, a tobacco dip company that was sponsoring all the matches called Red Man. And they had They had a Renegades deal. So he calls the guy and says, hey, how would you like to be able to give samples out in Dallas? And the guy goes, how much is it going to cost me? And he goes, $60,000. So they were $120,000 in debt, and that's everything: trash collection, bill, taxes. They were $120,000. So Jerry bought that property or brought that territory for $70,000 and made money for about a year out of it. So made his money back, but it set up kind of the angle. Michael kind of set up the angle a little later on for that deal when they went into the bingo hall up in up in Philly.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So USWA at this point, and this is what Memphis is, has evolved. And you have like brilliant minds like Dutch, and you have great tag teams like PG-13, which honestly, like I love Wolf D. Jamie is about my size, which is not a fighter. And you just look at it, it's like they did the best they could for so long with the USWA, and they scrapped along, and then they started doing like collaborative shows with WWE, which was just everything that they could do to try to hold on in the 90s. And ECW became this underground phenomenon, and there was crossover talent with it. And they did the best they could do. But at that point, you had, as a wrestling fan who grew up and started in 84, if I still see, Dutch, and I love Dutch, like still main eventing.
Love Dutch.
But there's nobody for him to go against. And I'm like, it's time to close the doors, but they wouldn't. And I loved it, but I loved like the kind of cross promotion they did. They involved Cornette, who's a heat magnet. I mean, everybody loves Cornette. If you don't love him, you're probably Kenny Omega in the Bucks. But I mean, it is what it is. Brass tacks and baseball bats, when it comes down to it, like things were starting to kind of close, and Vince McMahon did so much work with them as a developmental territory before he started using ECW as a developmental territory. Kurt Angle spent time in both places. There's a lot of people who spent time in both places. It was just different exposure. It was like, okay, well, let's do promos in Memphis, but let's get hardcore in ECW, and let's see if people like you or not, because they're going to the Attitude Era. And then it all boils out to the money kind of ran out.
Yeah. I mean, well, you're getting cherry picked anytime you do anything good. Even the little deal with PG-13, it gets cherry picked. Where do you have the Nation of Domination? They keep Wolfie and Jamie there for a few weeks, and then they whoop the hell out of them and send them on their way.
I mean, they kind of kicked their own asses on that one, but
that's another good tape to go back and watch.
Well, I talk to Wolfie sometimes. I'm trying to get him on the show, so.
Yeah.
But
I've got my about Jamie we won't go into, but
yeah, no.
Yeah. But that's what you were dealing with a lot. You had like Tommy Rich coming back into the area, and at that time, Tommy Rich was kind of done. And that's what Memphis became. It became they brought in some of the old guys because they would sell seats, but they were in their later years. And that young talent just wasn't there. And if it wasn't there very long, because it was in up in New York or up in Connecticut, soon after that. So that was pretty much the death of Memphis wrestling and territorial wrestling as we know it.
I think it was 1997 and 1998. It was officially sold to somebody in Cleveland because for some reason Jerry Lawler loves Cleveland. I grew up in Cleveland, and he's a big Indians fan. And so when it comes down to it, it was a bad sale and everything folded. And then I think the remnants became Music City Wrestling, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, when it comes down to it, it was the most influential, territory of all time, because you name a superstar besides the last 20 years, because when they folded, before that, everybody came through Memphis. Everybody came through Memphis. And Memphis was the biggest deal, and in a year and a half, it became just another territory.
You mentioned who you were pulling some facts out of a book there. I want to mention Spudnik, the Masked Men, and the Midgets, the early days of Memphis wrestling. Ron Hall, his son worked for me for years, and everybody. He's got a little quote on the back of the book that kind of describes the old days. And it says, if you grew up in Mid-South area watching these great wrestlers on a weekly basis, revisit the intensity of all these matches. If you were around during this great area, live vicariously through these pictures. I mean, that shows How big it was. You can just go back and look at these pictures, and you can turn a page and see a wrestler and go, oh, I remember the first time I saw him. And these are the great memories that you had in the territorial days. But now it's kind of shoved down our faces or down our throats. Somebody doesn't get the right push or the right angle, they're out. You don't get the storylines, or you don't get the angles that you did in those days. And it's a shame, but that's the way I guess modern wrestling is now. Old guys like me we had to adapt. But like I said, I got a mouthful of memories. So as long as I can talk, I can still remember the good old days.
I love this. Mav, do you have anything to add before we try to sign off? Because I have some ideas for the next show, but if you guys are all words, let's go.
So I believe the last thing that was said in the documentary was about the final showing of the broadcasting of Memphis wrestling was in 2001 before it was canceled and taken off the air. But it seemed like where the documentary actually had ended was when Jimmy Hart had left, as he got his call to go up to WWF to be at WrestleMania 1, as what I remember it saying. It just seems like such a different world from my perspective and what I grew up seeing, rather than how it used to be, and the way that we didn't have this empire that is the WWE with Vince McMahon at the helm, as it was, just completely changed everything. Where before it was like just so different, and I don't really know how to put it into words to an extent, besides the fact that it was all different regions, different conferences. You'd see people pop up in different ones and just show who they were to potentially try to make it to nationwide stardom and become a household name somehow. And WWF taking it over did ruin that, but at the same time, something that was also mentioned at the very end of the documentary by I believe it was Jackie Fargo, he had claimed that in today's age, with the internet and how it is, the territories most likely wouldn't have lasted, and it probably would have gone the same way, merging into one company or a couple of companies, as we still do have a couple larger ones around. But that's the end of my piece, honestly, for this topic.
Well, there you go. And I'll just add, thank you guys for letting me get a chance to run my mouth a little bit. And I hope somebody got a little enjoyment out of their day by listening. This is just our version of what we saw, but it is what we saw. There'll never be another era, I think, in entertainment, other than maybe the first part of the UFC. It was kind of interesting, and when it wasn't so big. But Memphis wrestling, I think, was a catalyst that started something. It took the wrestling out of the carnival days, like Maverick, you were saying, 3 sides with a curtain. It took it from that and helped propel it to what it is today. So, you look at the main catalyst, Jerry Lawler. Most of the time that you listen to WWE, some of the biggest times, you hear Lawler's voice. That's not a coincidence. That's just how good he was and still is. God bless him. Dealing with a heart attack. Hope he's feeling better and everything. But he is a living legend. And him, Jerry Jarrett, and some of these guys were way ahead of their time. But I'm going to back out of here. Michael, I'll let you take it from here on. And thank you, guys.
Well, it's being the beast from the East, the best from the Midwest, and I love you guys. I love my nephew, obviously, unconditionally. I love you, Memphis Mark, because I met you in 2003, and to have friends that stand that long in my life. I love you guys, and I think that we can produce a lot more stuff. I think that we did a great show, and we need to go forward. So next show, what do you guys think? Puerto Rico?
I think we need to throw a few names in a hat and just pull it out, because they're all great subjects.
All right, sounds like a plan, my man. Aside from that, guys, you can reach me at 144captain on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. And I just want to say that my friend John Watson has been in love with a girl named Katrina, and he's wanted to be mentioned on this, which he shouldn't because he loves her. So I want to say I love you both. And I want to say I love you, Jennifer, because I love you. And Maverick, if you ever want cousins, you better love her too. So, and Mark, you're the only guy to meet her. Actually, you're the only guy to meet my little baby redhead.
And she's real. She's actually real. I checked for batteries.
And beautiful as shit.
Yeah, very beautiful. It kind of it makes you look like when you walk in the room, everybody goes, "What the hell did he do?" So
thanks. Yeah, that's warranted. But anyway, I love you guys. So, Mr. Maverick, I acquiesce.
All right, guys, it's been a great show. I've really loved being a part of this. I love learning more stuff from you, Mark, and as well as you, Captain, or my uncle, as I can call you, as any day of the week. Glad that I'm able to communicate with you more than when I was growing up, and it's so nice having social media, but in the end, it did kind of kill a lot of things, but I digress on that. Anyways, if you guys want to reach me, we can talk about wrestling. You can give me topics for shows, any ideas that you guys may have. You can reach me at Maintenance Maverick or at Maintenance Mav on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. And anything you guys want to talk about, I'd like to suggest a quick book to you guys. The book that is written by Mick Foley about his experiences and getting up into the wrestling business. I believe it was called A Tale of Blood and Sweat Socks. I highly recommend that read.
Good book.
And with that, do something nice for somebody. You never know who needs it. And that's it for me. I'm out.
Peace. Memphis Mark, OG.
All right, brother. Give it out.
There we go.
Thanks for listening to the WWE Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a show, or head to WWEpodcast.com. And for all of these shows ad-free, head over to patreon.com/WWE Podcast. Until then, we'll see you next time.